Well, good afternoon, everybody, for the finale, grand finale, Dale Ahlquist. And he still got me confused because, we normally just exchange insults, and he was so sickeningly saccharine. I feel sort of obligated to sort of to reciprocate or replicate or whatever the word is. What I would say about Dale, in all honesty, is he is, amongst the many other things he is, of course, a great champion of GK Chesterton, and many of us came to know him in his persona as Chesterton's champion. He's also a great visionary, which I am not. And indeed, my friendship with Dale proves that. Because I remember years back, I can't remember the years, but he said, we used to have the annual Chesterton Conference in the Twin Cities every year, very well attended, several hundred, about 400 or 500, maybe more. And then he just said, I'm done, we're going to take it on the road. We're going to go to different parts of the country every year. And I said, you're mad. I said, you've got a captive audience here, they turn up every year, you've got people traveling from other parts of the United States, right? I mean, it's best of both worlds here, right? And it's on your doorstep. And so he did what he usually does, he ignored me. And the Chesterton Conference went on the road, and it's been travelling for the last 15 years or more. And it's obviously gone from strength to strength, and he's taken Chesterton to the country, one half of the country to come to him, so to speak. And then a few years after that, he said, I think I'm going to start a Chesterton Academy, a local high school. And I said, you're mad. I said, aren't you busy enough already doing what you're doing with the Chesterton Society? You're doing a great job. You must be very busy. You're travelling a lot. Why on earth would you want to do that? It's just going to suck your energy, suck your resources. You might compromise your abilities for the Chesterton Society to be a success. You're crazy. And so Dale, as a traditionalist, keeping up tradition, ignored me. And the rest is history. So it's 60 or so schools next year, you're hoping? Just 60 Cheddar. He started one in Twin Cities. 60. And he's keeping me very busy because I actually do quite a lot of speaking at fundraising galas in proper English, gala if you prefer to speak a foreign language. But fundraising galas for new Chesterton Academy. Just last week I was in Atlanta for a new one that's opening there. I've been in various other cities. So, but just it's a joy for me. Single-handedly, of course not single-handedly, he's the grace of God, he's got good people helping him. But certainly the vision was his, and the courage was his, and the common sense to ignore me was his. And if we should believe our Lord, and why would we not? By their fruits you should know them. So this is one of the most fruitful people I know. I give you Mr. Dale Ahlquist.
Well, I'm surprised there's still this many people here. But don't let me keep anybody awake here. It's a good time for a little siesta before dinner and everything, so let's just all relax. We had just 3 excellent talks today. Just wonderful, and I enjoyed each one of them. The only thing I can do now is to make up for their notable paucity in quoting Chesterton. That's about all I'm going to do is quote Chesterton. Let's just get right started. Here's the first Chesterton quotation right here. History is every bit as controversial as theology. All modern historians are divided into 2 classes. Those who tell half the truth, and those who tell none of the truth. Joseph, which category are you?
Chesterton's wrong.
He says, now the ordinary version of English history that most moderately educated people have absorbed from childhood is something like this. First slide, please. I don't have any slides. Those talks were so great today with the slides. And I said, I should do slides. But that would mean preparation and work. This is not my style. Here's the ordinary version of English history, that we emerged slowly from some semi-barbarism in which all the power and wealth were in the hands of kings and a few nobles, that the king's power was broken first, and then in due time that of the nobles, and that this piecemeal improvement was brought about by one class after another, waking up to a sense of citizenship and demanding a place in the national councils, frequently by riot or violence, and that in consequence of such menacing popular action, the franchise was granted to one class after another and used more and more to improve the social conditions of those classes until we practically became a democracy. That is the current, the view current at public schools and colleges, and it is part of the culture of all the classes that count for much in government. And there is not one word of truth in it from the beginning to the end. That's Chesterton. What really happened? Well, you've gotten a good taste of it today. You've gotten a very good mini course, condensed mini course in what really happened. In the Middle Ages, there was greater liberty and distribution of power and property than in the present age. Monasteries were places where men of poor origins could not only be educated, but become influential in the culture and the society. Guilds were places where men could learn a craft and work for themselves and not for a plant manager. Women had freedom and power and creativity in running the basic unit of society, the home. Small shops formed a line of defense against the big shops, and these things did not decay, they were murdered. They were ravaged and looted by an alliance of the royalty and the aristocracy. And when the looting began, only a few people in England grasped what was really happening, and even fewer took a stand against it, and they paid for it with their lives. They may not have even realized that they were defending property and livelihood and liberty and the very foundation of their culture. These were the incidental things that they were defending. The one thing they knew that they were defending was the Catholic faith. And that was the thing that they knew was being stolen from them. And that was the thing they died for. But in spite of their noble and dramatic and gruesome deaths, their history would be swept under the rug for the next 500 years. It was not until the 20th century that the Catholic Church beatified and then canonized the English martyrs. It wasn't until the 20th century, 500 years after it happened. It was almost as if the church itself wanted to remain quiet about what had happened in England. And even today, in England and in the rest of the world, most people seem to have forgotten the fact that Westminster Abbey was once an abbey. It was once a Benedictine abbey, and it had been taken from the Catholic Church, along with every other monastery in England and convent. All the monastery lands, as Joseph said, were given to aristocrats who were the allies of Henry VIII. And the monks and the abbots who did not flee for their lives or renounce their faith were hanged and drawn and quartered. And most of the monasteries were torn down and now stand in ruins, which make for very romantic landscapes and the stuff that painters and photographers and tourists like And for the aristocrats who gained the land, it was a sign of prestige to have a monastery ruin on your property. And for those aristocrats who weren't lucky enough to have real ruins, they built false ruins. And they were called follies. And some of the aristocrats renovated the abbeys and the monasteries and made them their homes. Downton Abbey, it's fictitious, but even in the fictional account, it was once a Catholic abbey that this aristocratic Anglican family took over. Chesterton makes a reference to it in his Father Brown story, The Red Moon of Maru. The story takes place, there's a theft of a jewel in a rich man's mansion, and the mansion's called Mallowwood Abbey. And after the story of the action is complete, Father Brown does solve the crime. I hope I'm not giving anything away. But he realizes that the theft of the jewel is insignificant in comparison to the much greater theft, the theft of the abbey itself from the Catholic Church. Chesterton, it's very clear, had a devotion to the English martyrs. In fact, when the new parish church was built in Beaconsfield, his hometown, where he was received into the church exactly 100 years ago, he was disappointed that when the church was built that it wasn't named for the English martyrs. That's what he had hoped it would be. But it was named for some French babe, Thérèse of Lisieux. But after he died, part of his bequeathment to the church was he gave money so that a side chapel could be built for the English martyrs. And visit Chesterton's church today, that side chapel is there, and it's designed to look like a prison cell, which is really, really cool. And there's statues of Thomas More and John Fisher in there. And the church has been renamed. It is now the Church of St. Teresa of the Child Jesus and Saints John Fisher and Thomas More. So Chesterton's church is named after the same guy that this college is named after. I think we're probably the only people on this campus today who have actually invoked John Fisher here. The main reason that Chesterton visited Rome in 1929 is never stated anywhere, but it's pretty obvious the main thing he did and came for was to attend the beatification of the English martyrs. He met Pope Pius XI in that same trip to Rome. He also met Mussolini. But in light of his great devotion to the English martyrs, he writes very little about them. It's surprising how few references he makes to any of them by name or to their amazing stories. He did a few passing references to John Fisher. He mentions how joyfully death was greeted by St. Edmund Campion in St. Robert Southwell. He says, "A man must have real joy in him before he can become a martyr." Joseph said I was going to talk about the Jesuit martyrs. He's wrong, I'm not. But it's a pity there's nothing that Chester wrote about. For instance, St. Margaret Clitheroe, who hid priests, St. Nicholas Owen, the great craftsman who built the priest holes, these remarkable hiding places for the priests that are still being discovered in the 20th century. They were so well hidden within the architecture. But there's one exception. There's one English martyr that Chesterton writes about, actually quite a bit, and that's St. Thomas More. Most of the world is familiar with Thomas More, who was chancellor under Henry VIII and would not approve of the king's divorce from Catherine of Aragon, and he was imprisoned in the Tower of London and eventually beheaded. Ironically, the reason why most people in the world are still familiar with Thomas More is due to an award-winning play and movie based on the play, A Man for All Seasons. And this play, the play and the screenplay were written by Robert Bolt, an atheist, which goes to show you that when a saint is canonized, he does not automatically become the exclusive property of the Catholic Church, as some people fear might happen if someone gets canonized. It's actually okay for other people to still like him and even admire him and write good plays and movies about him. Saints are somehow able to survive even the consequences of canonization. Now, Chesterton says that the death of the martyrs, especially of Thomas More, was tragic in many different ways, but of course it was triumphant in another way, in the essential way. Among other things, it was the tragedy of the Renaissance. In that tragedy, the wrong half of the Renaissance killed the right half of it. The consequences of the crime remain like a curse in all the complexities of our civilization today. And the first thing to note is that the restless Renaissance man, Henry VIII, did not know the harm that he was doing to himself and to all the things that he valued. He had no notion what would be the ultimate effect of his act on anything. Interesting enough, Henry VIII is not well liked in England. He's almost more disliked than their present king. Even Charles Dickens recognized Henry as a villain, called him wicked, called him a blot of blood and grease upon the history of England. And Chesterton says he was the embodiment of the devil in the Renaissance. The wild worship of, he's considered representing the wild worship of mere pleasure and scorn. And yet, Chesterton points out that Henry was very popular in his first days, that even the foreign contemporaries gave a glorious picture of this young prince of the Renaissance, radiant with all his new accomplishments. In his last days, he was something like a maniac. He no longer inspired love, he inspired fear. And with the exception of his first and last wives, Chesterton says that Henry VIII was almost as unlucky in his wives as they were in their husband. He says such strength as Henry VIII had was the strength of a badly trained horse that bolts. I love that one. That was a great one. Okay, I'll say it again. Such strength as Henry VIII had was the strength of a badly trained horse that bolts. I can do it again. All right. Here's another. He says, we forget that Henry VIII was an intellectual, but we remember that he was fat. He says, I've often wondered that no one has made so obvious a parallel as between that of the murders of Macbeth and the marriages of Henry VIII. Both Henry and Macbeth were originally brave, good-humored men, but better rather than the worst of their neighbors, both Henry and Macbeth hesitated over their first crime, the first stabbing and the first divorce. Both found out the fate which is in evil. For Macbeth went on murdering, and poor Henry went on marrying. There's only one fault in the parallel. Unfortunately for history, Henry VIII was not deposed. So yes, Henry murdered Thomas More and John Fisher. As Chesterton points out, he would have been very surprised by the fact that he murdered Mary England. By wantoning the wanton Anne Boleyn, or starting a diplomatic breach with a distant Italian papacy, he was destroying his entire culture, and he didn't know that that's what he was doing. But that's what happens when you start even a small breach with that distant Italian institution. Henry not only cut off England from Europe, he cut off England from England, which is exactly the story that was told here today. Henry would never have imagined that a century after him, it would be a king, Charles I, being beheaded by Puritans. The topsy-turvy reversal in that 100 years is an exact model of what really happens when men transfer their loyalty from a changeless to a changing religion. It would lead to a war on Merry England and the traditional Christian feasts like Christmas. Henry didn't see that coming either. But when a man simply starts a personal policy somewhere, he starts something that may end anywhere. It doesn't stop there. Oliver Cromwell, after killing his king for the sake of his religion, never could have imagined that less than a century and a half after him, there'd be Christian ministers doubting the divinity of Christ. And anyone now supporting those ministers, says Chesterton, is in the same position. They don't know what it is that they're going to be supporting a century after that, what that's going to lead to. Meanwhile, the heroism of John Fisher and the humanism of Thomas More are permanent possessions of the world, because they are possessions of its only permanent institution. They are what is perhaps only true of the dead and the beatified and the martyred. They are safe. So, in Thomas More's great disagreement with Henry VIII, Chester points out something that I think most of us have never thought of. He says that Henry VIII, he reminds us that Henry VIII was as much an Orthodox Catholic as was Thomas More. He was rigid in his faith, in every detail of Catholicism, perhaps even too rigid. He had a hatred of heresies. He was merciless about heresies. He got into this great condemnation of Martin Luther, wrote a treatise against Martin Luther. Chester points out that in the debate between Luther and Henry VIII, it can't be considered as serious as it might be, because it consisted mostly of Luther confining himself almost entirely to the most foul-mouthed personal abuse of Henry VIII, and then of course Henry VIII afterwards doing all he could to deserve that abuse. And he says that Henry, to the very end, thought himself more Catholic than the Pope. He made himself the Pope. That's how Catholic he thought he was. That in his own understanding of theology, he could make it work. He was a Catholic in everything except that he was not a Catholic. He observed everything down to the last bead and candle. He accepted everything down to the last deduction from a definition. He accepted everything except Rome. And in that instant of refusal, his religion became a different religion. What was the matter with him was that he was the sort of rigid churchman who always does, consciously or unconsciously, want to be the head of the church. There are Catholic laymen whom their priests will mournfully recognize the type. Everything in the church must be absolute Catholic, which is to say, I will decide. Now, Thomas More was a layman of exactly the opposite type, says Chesterton. He was indeed, in his interior life, intensely sacramental and even ascetic. And his real religion was the sort of, in his real religion, he was the sort of saint that possesses but never parades. But Thomas More did not make himself his own judge, and he did not make himself the judge of the church. He preferred the judgment of the church, not only of himself, but of such things as marriage. More died for the papacy because it was part of a truth, the truth. Not because it was his favorite part, or to him and his friends a particularly sympathetic or popular part. This, of course, is profoundly true. The need for the papacy is more obvious now than it was then. Nevertheless, this is true. The true relation between the martyr and the doctrine for which he died. That he died not only defending the Pope, but for defying the sort of man who wants to be Pope. There's no true Pope who wants to be Pope. And of course, he died for he died as a traitor because he was opposed to an absolute monarchy. In the idea of treating the monarch as the absolute authority. He was eager to respect the monarchy for what it was. That's why his last words, were, the king's good servant and God's first. And he was loyal to and felt sorry for Henry VIII at the same time. And that's, of course, one of the saintly things about him. Not only forgiving his enemy, but loving his enemy. And maintaining his sense of humor. He was certainly a champion of liberty because Thomas More was a champion of the home and the sanctity of the family. Thomas More died as much for defending the faith as defending the family. This is Chesterton's great point. By opposing divorce that was simply not approved by the church, Thomas More was defending the family. He says, Chesterton, that if individuals have any hope of protecting their freedom, they must protect family life. As a champion of liberty, he says if the state gets too much power, it'll take away the freedom of the home. And it's in an essay on Thomas More that Chesterton says, the state had less power when it could send a man to be burned at the stake than it does now when it sends him to the public school. It's one of the reasons I helped start Chesterton Academy, because only with the grassroots revival of taking back education can we do anything to undermine the really insidious effect that public education has had on our culture. It's probably one of the most destructive things to our culture today. Thomas More was famous for his sense of humor, and again, humor is a thing in the home. The private life is the perpetual comedy, says Chesterton. And of course, he's also famous on the scaffold for saying to the executioner, "See me safely up. Coming down, I can take care of myself." But if history had happened any different to that particular man at that moment, all of our history would have been different. Because of his martyrdom, we know that we have a champion for what's right. And the thing about the martyrs, he's still alive, right? The saints are still alive and still working on our behalf. He was a mystic and a martyr, and martyrdom is perhaps the one thing that deserves the cant phrase of practical mysticism. But he was not, like so many mystics of his time, one who lost his common sense in the face of mysteries. It will remain a permanent and determining fact, a hinge of history, that he saw in that hour of madness that Rome and reason are one. He saw that at the very beginning, what so many have now only begun to see at the end, that the real hopes of learning and liberty lay in preserving the Roman unity of Europe and the ancient Christian loyalty for which he died. It looked like Henry had won, and that Thomas More had lost, and that the new Church of England had triumphed over the Church of Rome. That's what it looked like 500 years ago. And as we learned in our previous history lesson, the Catholic Church kept taking a beating for the next 100, 200, 300 years. But, as Chesterton said, and was quoted before, Christianity has died many times and come back to life. It has a God who knew his way out of the grave. It started slowly. In the 18th century, the great Englishman who's often compared to Chesterton, Dr. Samuel Johnson, a devout Christian, but an Anglican, admitted that a man who leaves the Church of England for the Catholic Church gains something, whereas a Catholic who becomes an Anglican loses something. Then, of course, the 19th century, the Emancipation, the Catholics could build their own churches, worship freely again. And then you have Newman and the Oxford Revival. And in the 20th century, this wave of conversions. Certainly Chesterton is the most prominent of all the English converts of the 20th century, but there were some other giants. Robert Hugh Benson, who was the son of the Archbishop of Canterbury. And of course Ronald Knox, another outstanding convert. When I finish all my work on Chesterton, I'm going to do Ronald Knox next, by the way. That's what I am. I'm almost done, too. Probably should do the little segue here. My great friend and Chestertonian from Norway, Geir Hosnes, yes, has finally completed, after more than 30 years, his bibliography of G.K. Chesterton. I've been working with him, and so another army of volunteers, truly. 3 volumes. This is just a bibliography. This isn't what Chesterton wrote himself. This is the list of what he wrote and the list of things of the translations, of the scholarly work on him, a record of his speeches, a record of everything. 3 volumes, 1,200 pages, 44,000 entries. And I just got my hands on the copy of this last week and wanted to get lost in it. If I'd spent any more time, I never would have emerged. I wouldn't have come on this trip. It's just too fun. I've been watching it form. What a monumental achievement. But you realize Chesterton's achievement as well. He's just one of the great minds of the 20th century. The fact that he came to the Catholic Church is such an outstanding witness. then, as we said, Thomas More and the English martyrs were finally canonized in the 20th century. I'll tell you a little story. When I was invited to speak at the House of Lords by one of the two Catholic members of the House of Lords, Lord David Alton, took me in there and he showed me around Parliament. And he brought me into the Great Hall. That's where all the dignitaries do things like lie in state when they're dead. And he brought me to the center of this great and historic hall. And there, in the very center of the floor, is a plaque. And it says, "On this spot, Thomas More was condemned to death." And it says, "Dale, look around. Do you see any references to Henry VIII in here?" And then he said, "When I brought Mother Teresa in here, she knelt and kissed the plaque." I said, "Okay, I missed that opportunity." No. And then he said, and of course the press was waiting to interview her at the other end of the hall, and I noticed there were no members of the press waiting to interview me, so there was no one there to see that I hadn't knelt and kissed the plaque. But he said he escorted her over there, and the first question that they asked her was, "Mother Teresa, what would you do about the homeless problem here in London?" And she answered, "There's plenty of room in this building." And now we're at the 21st century. And we see now that John Henry Newman has been beatified and canonized. When Pope Benedict created the English Ordinariate, because there was such a growing number of conversions from the Church of England to the Catholic Church, he responded to a need by that allowing them to keep the church that they'd been so faithful to, to use the rites and to make them Catholic and make those adjustments so that they could be in a Catholic church that still looked Anglican, because that Anglican church used to be a Catholic church, you know. And the response was actually quite tepid when he first announced it. But then he came to England and beatified John Henry Newman. And there was this huge wave of conversions in the country. Whole churches becoming Catholic. I had another experience when I was in England once visiting the town of Compton, where George Frederick Watts was from. He was a painter, and Chesterton had written a book on Watts. And the museum there, the Watts Foundation, had asked me to write an introduction to a republication of that book, and I found some more essays on Watts that were included in the book. And I had the privilege of going to visit the museum, and the museum itself had fallen into disrepair, and it was a local woman who led the charge to renovate it and get it up again. It's a beautiful facility now. And she is a Roman Catholic from this town. And she also helped renovate the Anglican Church and raise money to install a new organ in the Anglican Church. They said, "Why are you doing all this stuff? You're Catholic." And she said, "Because we're going to get the church back one of these days." Another time when I was in England, I was with someone, and we noticed that he had a little lapel pin. I said, "What's that lapel pin?" He said, "Oh, I'm a member of the St. Justin Martyrs Society." I said, "Well, what's that?" "Well, we just simply go into former Catholic churches and pray. That's all." And I said, "That's beautiful." Because those former Catholic churches, of course, are all Anglican churches now, and they are continually emptying out. And at some point, they're going to have to decide what to do with them. I think they're going to have to give them back to their original owners. This is part of that renewal. I mean, Justin Martyr, he had nothing to do with English church history, but he was a martyr. Chesterton says this is the modern achievement, that a human being may yet suffer in order to remain sane, as a man once suffered to be a saint or a martyr. This is the great battle. We live in this insane world. Chesterton was very much the prophet of the insanity of the modern world. And we're going to have to suffer for not only remaining sane ourselves, but fighting to restore a sane world. But it's only going to be done with a Catholic revival. That's the only way it's going to be done. And we had this great look at history today. Newman's great line, to be deep in history is to cease to be Protestant. Chesterton has the corollary. He says, in order to be a Protestant, it is necessary to have a short memory. He said Thomas More, at the time of More's beatification, Chesterton said Thomas More is more important in the present than he was in his own lifetime. He said Thomas More will be more important in the future than he is in our time, because he was defending not only the faith against the state, but the family against the state. Chesterton understood that was the great threat that was coming. And the comparison is significant because I would say that G.K. Chesterton is more important now than he was in his own lifetime, and he will be more important in the future than he is now. God bless you all. Thank you.